As Sarah, Michael, and Mrs. Evans approached the security office at the venue, the air was tense with anticipation. Inside, they were greeted by the security manager, who was surprised to see the wedding party in his office on what was supposed to be a joyous occasion. "How can I help?" he asked, his brow furrowed in concern upon seeing their worried faces. Mrs. Evans quickly explained the situation about the missing heirloom necklace. The security manager nodded and began accessing the video feeds from cameras installed around the venue, including the one outside Mrs. Evans' room. The small room felt even smaller as everyone gathered around the monitor, watching the footage closely. The video from the morning showed various people passing by, but none seemed suspicious. As they continued watching, Sarah felt every second of the footage tick by, her hope of resolving the issue before the ceremony dwindling. Beside her, Michael squeezed her hand, a silent promise of support no matter the outcome. After what felt like hours but were only a few minutes, they reached the time frame when the theft could have occurred. Everyone leaned in closer as the screen showed a figure approaching Mrs. Evans' room. The person looked around cautiously before entering, but the angle of the camera did not reveal their face. A collective breath was held, then released in frustration when the figure reemerged, their identity still hidden. The security manager paused and rewound the footage, trying different angles from other cameras to catch a glimpse of the person's face. Unfortunately, clarity eluded them, the resolution too low to make out any definitive features. Sarah's heart sank. It seemed like they were back to square one, with no closer to finding the necklace or clearing her name. With a heavy heart, Sarah suggested they return to preparing for the ceremony. "Let's not let this ruin our day. We'll figure something out," she said, trying to muster a smile. Mrs. Evans, however, remained quiet, her eyes clouded with worry and doubt. Michael, ever the mediator, thanked the security manager and led the way out, his arm protectively around Sarah. Back at the bridal suite, Sarah's bridesmaids enveloped her in a group hug, their presence a comforting balm to her fraying nerves. They whispered words of encouragement, telling her not to lose hope. "We're here for you, no matter what," they assured her. Their support was a light in the gloom, and Sarah felt a bit of strength return. Meanwhile, whispers among the wedding guests had turned into murmurs of concern. The festive spirit had dampened, and in its place, a wave of speculation washed over the crowd. Rumors began to spread, filling the gaps where facts were missing. Determined not to let the situation overshadow her wedding day, Sarah made a decision. She took a deep breath and addressed the gathering crowd, her voice clear and composed. "There's been a misunderstanding, but I assure you it will be resolved. Today is a celebration of love and family, and I hope we can all focus on that." Her statement, brave and poised, brought a round of applause from the guests, their respect for her evident. As the applause died down, Sarah returned to her room to prepare for the walk down the aisle. Despite the unresolved issue, she resolved to carry herself with grace, the love for Michael a steady flame burning in her heart. The ceremony was fast approaching, and she was determined to face it with a smile, the cloud of suspicion notwithstanding. The day started like any other for the rough biker, whose reputation in the small town was anything but kind. His large, loud motorcycle roared down the empty street, its engine vibrating the ground beneath. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden hue over everything, yet the biker remained indifferent to the beauty around him. To him, this neighborhood was just another stop on his journey. His leather jacket, weathered and full of patches, signaled he had been through many tough spots in his life. He didn't care much for the usual norms of society and had built a life where he did what he wanted when he wanted. As he sped through the quiet park, he noticed a dog sitting by a bench. The dog, a friendly golden retriever, appeared calm, watching the world go by. It wasn't a stray. It looked well-fed and cared for. Still, the biker, in his usual manner, didn't think twice. He slowed his motorcycle as he approached the dog. Maybe he was bored. Maybe he just felt like causing some trouble. Whatever the reason, he found a strange satisfaction in disturbing something peaceful. Without any real reason, he decided to kick the dog, a cruel act of aggression that served no purpose but to exert power over something smaller and weaker. The dog yelped in surprise and pain, jumping back from the sudden kick. Its tail tucked between its legs, and it whimpered, confused by the unexpected assault. The biker chuckled to himself, as if he had just performed some great feat. For a moment, he felt a rush of power, his tough exterior pleased with the way the dog had reacted. He watched the dog for a second, expecting it to bark or run off. But it only looked back at him, its eyes wide and frightened. What the biker didn't know was that the dog's owner, Keanu Reeves, was nearby. Keanu had been walking through the park, enjoying the quiet time, and had stopped to take a break on a bench not far from where the incident took place. He had noticed the biker speeding through the park, but didn't think much of it, until the sound of the dog's yelp reached his ears. His heart sank as he realized what had happened. Keanu stood up from the bench, his calm demeanor slowly turning to one of concern and anger. He had always been a man who believed in kindness and respect for animals, and seeing the biker's cruel action immediately ignited something in him. Yet, instead of rushing over in a fury, Keanu took a deep breath. He knew that reacting impulsively could only escalate the situation. Instead, he watched the biker for a moment, weighing his options. The biker was still laughing to himself, unaware that someone had seen his terrible behavior. Keanu stepped forward, his steps deliberate and calm. He was determined to address the situation in the right way, to show the biker that cruelty wasn't the answer. He wasn't looking for a confrontation, but he couldn't ignore what had just happened. Keanu knew that if he let this moment pass without saying something, it would be a missed opportunity to stand up for what was right. As he approached, he noticed the biker still laughing, completely unaware that Keanu Reeves, someone who truly valued animals, was about to confront him. This was just the beginning. Keanu was ready to step in, but the biker's next reaction would determine how the situation unfolded. Would he apologize or continue to act arrogantly? The stage was set for what would become a life-changing moment for both the biker and everyone who witnessed it. Keanu took a deep breath, his calm demeanor never faltering as he moved closer to the biker. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. The golden retriever, still sitting near the bench, was recovering from the shock of the kick. It looked up at Keanu, its eyes filled with confusion, but no real fear. Keanu, with his natural connection to animals, reached down and gently stroked the dog's head, offering a sense of reassurance. His touch was soft, comforting, the exact opposite of what the biker had just done. The biker, still oblivious to who Keanu was, noticed the man walking toward him. He could see that Keanu wasn't angry in the traditional sense. There was no shouting or fuming. Instead, Keanu's expression was composed, thoughtful, and calm. For a moment, the biker wondered if he'd done something wrong, but he quickly pushed that thought aside, too wrapped up in his own arrogance. Keanu stopped just a few feet away from the biker, standing tall and steady. There was no need to raise his voice. His presence alone commanded respect. With a steady gaze, Keanu locked eyes with the biker. There was no animosity in Keanu's eyes, only a quiet expectation, as though waiting for the biker to understand what was happening. "You hurt that dog," Keanu said softly, his voice carrying through the air. The biker shrugged, a smile still lingering on his face as he looked at the dog with a dismissive glance. "It's just a dog. No big deal," the biker replied casually, completely unaware that he was speaking to someone who had dedicated his life to kindness and respect for all living beings. Keanu's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. "It's not about the dog," he said, taking another step closer. "It's about how we treat others, whether they're humans or animals. They all deserve respect." The biker raised an eyebrow, still not fully grasping the gravity of the situation. "And what are you going to do about it?" he asked with a smirk, his tone still dismissive. "Call the cops. You think I care about some soft lecture?" He snorted, clearly not realizing that he was about to learn a lesson he wouldn't forget. Keanu took another calm step forward, his demeanor still unruffled. There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet resolve. He wasn't here to argue or to escalate things. Instead, he was showing the biker that there were other ways to handle life's challenges, ways that didn't involve cruelty or arrogance. Sometimes, Keanu began, it's not about winning an argument. It's about showing someone a better way to live, a better way to treat the world around them. He paused, giving the biker a chance to reflect, but the biker remained defiant, his posture still tense and unyielding. A small crowd had begun to gather, whispers spreading as more people recognized who Keanu was. They stood quietly at a distance, watching with curiosity. The biker's attitude shifted slightly as he caught wind of the murmurs from the bystanders. It didn't take long for him to realize that the man he had just mocked was none other than Keanu Reeves, a global superstar known for roles in films that many bikers admired. Films that celebrated resilience, strength, and integrity. His casual bravado began to wane. Keanu's words hung in the air, reaching the biker's ears in a way that no one else's might have. There was no immediate change, no instant transformation. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and the biker was starting to see that maybe, just maybe, he had crossed a line. Keanu's quiet approach had already begun to stir something in him, something the biker hadn't expected to feel. Just remember, Keanu added, his voice soft but serious. Kindness doesn't cost anything, but it makes a world of difference. The biker was left standing there, caught between his own pride and the realization that he'd made a mistake. He wasn't sure what to say next, but Keanu, without waiting for a response, turned and walked back to his dog, his actions speaking louder than words ever could. The biker stood there, staring at Keanu as he walked away. A strange silence hung in the air, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the breeze. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. He had expected anger, a confrontation, maybe even a fight, but instead, he had been met with something far more unsettling, calmness and understanding. It was like Keanu had reached inside him and stirred something he hadn't even known was there. For a moment, the biker simply watched Keanu, who was now kneeling beside his dog, offering a few gentle words to reassure the animal. The dog, who had been scared moments earlier, was now calm and nuzzling up to Keanu as if it had known him for years. The biker couldn't help but notice the contrast. Here was a man who, instead of reacting with aggression, had chosen kindness and empathy. And the dog, who had been hurt, responded with trust and affection. The biker's chest tightened. What had he done? The satisfaction he had felt moments ago, the rush of power from kicking the dog, seemed so distant now. It was as if the weight of his actions was finally sinking in. He had been cruel for no reason at all. There was no thrill in it, no joy. In fact, he felt a bit ashamed. The way Keanu had handled the situation made him realize how unnecessary his actions had been. As he stood there, the crowd that had gathered began to disperse, some of them still whispering, others shaking their heads. The biker felt their eyes on him, and the embarrassment grew. He had made a fool of himself. But it wasn't just about public humiliation. It was about the nagging feeling that something inside him had shifted, something that made him want to apologize, to make things right. But he didn't know how. He had never been one to admit when he was wrong. Keanu, sensing that the moment was not quite over, slowly stood up from the bench. His dog, still beside him, was calm and happy, clearly at ease once again. Keanu turned back to the biker, who stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Keanu smiled, a small, gentle smile. There was no judgment in it, no anger, only an understanding, as if to say, it's okay to learn. Keanu took a step toward the biker. "You're not a bad person," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But you're capable of more than what you just showed. It's never too late to choose better." His words were simple, but they felt like a challenge. The biker knew deep down that Keanu was right. He wasn't a bad person, but he had made a bad choice. For the first time, the biker felt the weight of what he had done, and it didn't feel good. It felt like a mistake that could be fixed if he chose to learn from it. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out. He didn't know what to say. There was nothing he could say to take back what had happened. Keanu seemed to sense his hesitation. He gave the biker a soft nod, and then, as if offering the chance for redemption, turned to walk away, gently tugging on the leash to guide his dog along. It wasn't an invitation to follow, but it was a sign that there was no hard feelings, no harsh words, just the quiet hope that the biker would take a step forward in his own life, just as Keanu had done with kindness. The biker stood there a little longer, watching Keanu walk away. It was a moment that would stick with him for a long time, a moment that made him think about how he wanted to live his life from that point on. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. Maybe, just maybe, he could be better. The biker watched as Keanu and his dog disappeared into the distance, the sounds of their footsteps fading as they walked farther down the park path. There was a strange feeling in his chest, like a heavy weight pressing down on him. He stood still for a long time, his mind swirling with confusion and a tinge of guilt. The harsh laughter that had bubbled up inside him earlier now felt foolish. His usual tough exterior, the one that protected him from feeling anything too deeply, suddenly felt hollow. People had been talking in hushed tones, a few whispering about what had just happened. The biker could feel the eyes of the small crowd on him. He looked around, hoping someone would say something, maybe offer him some kind of reassurance. But there was only silence, the kind of silence that made everything feel too loud. Every thought, every question, seemed to echo inside his head. It wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about the realization that Keanu had made him see himself in a way he hadn't wanted to. The biker wasn't used to feeling bad about his actions. He had spent years pretending to be tough, to act like he didn't care about anything. He had learned to hide his emotions behind a shield of sarcasm and anger. But today, for some reason, it wasn't working. He looked back at the dog, who was now sitting calmly by the bench, watching him. The dog didn't look afraid anymore. It was as though it had forgiven him in an instant. How could it? It had been kicked and hurt, and yet it didn't hold on to the pain. The biker envied that. The dog had shown more forgiveness in its quiet eyes than he had in his entire life. Something inside him shifted, a small but noticeable change. He felt a pull, a desire to make things right. Maybe it was the way Keanu had handled the whole thing, or maybe it was the disappointment in his own heart. Whatever it was, he knew he had to do something. He couldn't just walk away and pretend it hadn't happened. With a sigh, he turned and started to walk toward the dog. The crowd had thinned out, most people going back to their business. But the biker couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he needed to take responsibility. He had wronged the dog, and maybe even Keanu, without ever realizing the impact of his actions. As he approached the dog, it lifted its head, its eyes soft and trusting. The biker knelt down slowly, unsure of what to do or say. He didn't have the words, but he knew that words weren't always necessary. What mattered was showing genuine remorse, proving that he understood the harm he had caused. The biker reached out tentatively, his hand shaking slightly, and gently touched the dog's fur. The dog nuzzled him, responding to the touch with warmth and affection. The biker's heart swelled, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a connection, not to his motorcycle, or his reputation, or the world that had always seemed so cold and harsh, but to something pure, something simple. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about recognizing the moment, the quiet truth that sometimes kindness is the strongest thing you can give. He sat there with the dog for a while, just petting it and thinking. In that moment, he realized something. He wasn't too far gone to change. He had a chance, a real opportunity to be better, not just for the dog, but for himself. He stood up after a few minutes, a sense of peace settling over him. He wasn't sure what his next steps would be, but he knew he would start by making things right. Maybe it wouldn't be easy, and maybe it wouldn't happen all at once, but the desire to be better had taken root. And as the last of the crowd dispersed, leaving the park quiet once more, the biker turned and began walking down the path, his steps a little lighter than before. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a small beginning toward the kind of person he wanted to become. The biker watched as Keanu and his dog disappeared into the distance, the sounds of their footsteps fading as they walked farther down the park path. There was a strange feeling in his chest, like a heavy weight pressing down on him. He stood still for a long time, his mind swirling with confusion and a tinge of guilt. The harsh laughter that had bubbled up inside him earlier now felt foolish. His usual tough exterior, the one that protected him from feeling anything too deeply, suddenly felt hollow. People had been talking in hushed tones, a few whispering about what had just happened. The biker could feel the eyes of the small crowd on him. He looked around, hoping someone would say something, maybe offer him some kind of reassurance. But there was only silence, the kind of silence that made everything feel too loud. Every thought, every question, seemed to echo inside his head. It wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about the realization that Keanu had made him see himself in a way he hadn't wanted to. The biker wasn't used to feeling bad about his actions. He had spent years pretending to be tough, to act like he didn't care about anything. He had learned to hide his emotions behind a shield of sarcasm and anger. But today, for some reason, it wasn't working. He looked back at the dog, who was now sitting calmly by the bench, watching him. The dog didn't look afraid anymore. It was as though it had forgiven him in an instant. How could it? It had been kicked and hurt, and yet it didn't hold on to the pain. The biker envied that. The dog had shown more forgiveness in its quiet eyes than he had in his entire life. Something inside him shifted, a small but noticeable change. He felt a pull, a desire to make things right. Maybe it was the way Keanu had handled the whole thing, or maybe it was the disappointment in his own heart. Whatever it was, he knew he had to do something. He couldn't just walk away and pretend it hadn't happened. With a sigh, he turned and started to walk toward the dog. The crowd had thinned out, most people going back to their business. But the biker couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he needed to take responsibility. He had wronged the dog, and maybe even Keanu, without ever realizing the impact of his actions. As he approached the dog, it lifted its head, its eyes soft and trusting. The biker knelt down slowly, unsure of what to do or say. He didn't have the words, but he knew that words weren't always necessary. What mattered was showing genuine remorse, proving that he understood the harm he had caused. The biker reached out tentatively, his hand shaking slightly, and gently touched the dog's fur. The dog nuzzled him, responding to the touch with warmth and affection. The biker's heart swelled, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a connection, not to his motorcycle, or his reputation, or the world that had always seemed so cold and harsh, but to something pure, something simple. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about recognizing the moment, the quiet truth that sometimes kindness is the strongest thing you can give. He sat there with the dog for a while, just petting it and thinking. In that moment, he realized something. He wasn't too far gone to change. He had a chance, a real opportunity to be better, not just for the dog, but for himself. He stood up after a few minutes, a sense of peace settling over him. He wasn't sure what his next steps would be, but he knew he would start by making things right. Maybe it wouldn't be easy, and maybe it wouldn't happen all at once, but the desire to be better had taken root. And as the last of the crowd dispersed, leaving the park quiet once more, the biker turned and began walking down the path, his steps a little lighter than before. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a small beginning toward the kind of person he wanted to become. The biker walked slowly down the path, his mind still turning over what had just happened. Keanu's words echoed in his head. It's never too late to choose better. Those simple words had hit him harder than anything he had ever heard before. He had spent his life running from responsibility, hiding behind a tough facade. But now, for the first time, he was questioning that life, wondering if he could change. He couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond redemption. The park had quieted down, the last of the people leaving for the day. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting a soft, golden light over everything. The biker glanced back at the bench, where Keanu and his dog had been just moments earlier. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him again. He had hurt the dog, but more than that, he had hurt himself. How had he become so cold, so careless? As he walked, he realized he didn't know what to do next. He had no clue how to make things right. He wasn't used to apologizing or making amends. His pride always got in the way, convincing him that he didn't need to answer to anyone. But that day, something inside him had cracked. The biker knew he couldn't just leave things as they were. His thoughts were interrupted by a small voice calling out from behind him. He turned to see a young woman walking toward him, her eyes curious. She had been part of the crowd earlier, one of the bystanders who had witnessed the whole scene. She smiled as she approached, but there was no judgment in her expression, just an open, understanding gaze. "Hey," she said softly. "Are you okay?" The biker didn't know how to answer. The question seemed simple, but it went straight to the heart of what he had been struggling with. Was he okay? No, he wasn't. Not really. But he was beginning to think that it was okay not to be okay, that maybe this moment of discomfort was exactly what he needed. "Yeah," he replied, his voice hesitant. "Just thinking." The woman nodded, her smile remaining gentle. "I saw what happened earlier. I just wanted to say, I think you did the right thing, just now. With the dog, I mean." The biker frowned, confused. "What do you mean? I didn't do anything right." She shrugged slightly, her eyes full of understanding. "You didn't yell or argue. You didn't let your pride get in the way. That's more than a lot of people would do. Not everyone would take a step back like that." The biker was taken aback. He hadn't expected anyone to acknowledge his actions, especially not in a positive way. For a moment, he was silent, just absorbing her words. Maybe he wasn't as far gone as he thought. Maybe this was the start of something different. "I don't know what came over me," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I've been a jerk for too long. I don't know how to fix it." The woman smiled kindly. "It's a process. You don't have to fix everything all at once. Just start small. Start with the dog, maybe. Maybe start with yourself." Her words were simple, but they held a truth that the biker hadn't considered before. He didn't need to change overnight. There was no magic fix for his mistakes, but he could start with the small things, the things that mattered. He could be kinder to animals, to others, and maybe most importantly, to himself. "I'm going to make it right," he said, more to himself than to her. "I don't know how yet, but I will." The woman nodded, her eyes sparkling with encouragement. "That's all anyone can do. You've got this." As she walked away, the biker felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was carrying a burden. He wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time, he was ready to face it. He had made a mistake, but he could correct it. And in doing so, maybe he would find a new kind of strength, one that didn't come from arrogance or cruelty, but from humility and change. The evening sun cast a warm glow over the park as he walked back toward the place where it all began, determined to take the first step in making things right. It wasn't going to be easy, but he had already made the most important decision: to try. The biker's heart was heavy as he walked back toward the bench where the dog had been sitting. He couldn't stop thinking about the way things had unfolded, about the simple but powerful shift inside him. He had always believed that being tough, not letting anything bother him, was the way to survive. But now he was starting to realize that maybe that wasn't the answer. Maybe real strength came from acknowledging when you've done something wrong and taking steps to make it right. The park was quieter now, the evening air crisp and fresh. The sky was painted in soft shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sounds of the city, which had once felt distant, now seemed more real. The laughter of children from a nearby playground, the rustling of leaves in the trees, and the distant hum of traffic all seemed to pull him back to the present moment. He wasn't lost in his thoughts anymore. He was here, and he had something important to do. As he approached the spot where Keanu and his dog had been, he slowed his pace. The dog was gone, but the memory of its trusting eyes stayed with him. He paused for a moment, standing in the place where it had all happened. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to make amends for it. And maybe that was the first step toward redemption. The biker felt a pull to do something more than just apologize to the dog. He needed to prove to himself that he could be better, that he could follow through on the promise he had made to change. He had spent so many years living with his defenses up, not letting anyone or anything get close. But now, as strange as it seemed, he wanted to make things right. He wasn't sure how, but he knew he couldn't just walk away and forget. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see a man approaching, an older gentleman with a warm smile. The man nodded in recognition, as if he had been waiting for the biker to show up. He wasn't familiar, but there was a certain kindness in the way he carried himself. "You look like you've been through something," the man said, his voice gentle but knowing. The biker was caught off guard by the stranger's words. He hadn't said anything about what had happened, but it seemed as though the man could sense it. Maybe it was the way he was standing, or maybe it was the quiet air of reflection that surrounded him. I guess I have," the biker replied, feeling a bit vulnerable. "I did something earlier that I wish I could take back." The man nodded, understanding. "It happens to the best of us. The key is what you do next. Apologies are good, but actions speak louder than words." The biker took a deep breath. "I know. I just don't know how to make it right." The man smiled kindly. "Start by being the person you want to be. The rest will follow." The biker looked down at the ground for a moment, letting the words sink in. The man wasn't offering any easy answers, but somehow that was what he needed. He wasn't looking for a quick fix. He needed to do the hard work of becoming someone better, someone who didn't hurt others just for amusement. "Thanks," the biker said, his voice a bit steadier than before. The man simply nodded again, as if he had said all that was needed. He turned and walked away, leaving the biker alone in the quiet park. The sound of his footsteps faded, but the sense of peace he had left behind lingered. The biker stood there for a few more moments, thinking about the man's words. "Start by being the person you want to be." It sounded so simple, but it was the kind of advice that stuck with you. The biker wasn't sure if he had found all the answers, but he knew he had found something far more important, a starting point. With a final glance at the bench, he turned and walked in the opposite direction, determined to take the next step. He didn't know exactly what it would look like, but he was ready to begin. And for the first time, he felt that he was heading in the right direction. The biker walked away from the park with a sense of resolve he hadn't felt in a long time. Each step felt different, like he was walking with a new purpose. His mind was still processing everything that had happened that day, how he had been confronted, how he had been made to face his actions, and how, for the first time, he felt like he had a chance to make things right. The feeling of guilt that had weighed so heavily on him earlier had started to lift, replaced by something more positive, a determination to not let his past define him. As he walked down the quiet street, his thoughts kept returning to the dog. He had acted out of impulse earlier, something he was used to doing. But now he understood how his actions had impacted the animal. It wasn't just about the dog. It was about the choices we make in life. The biker realized that all his life, he had been making decisions based on fear or anger, never truly thinking about the consequences of his actions on others. That day had opened his eyes to the fact that change was possible. He didn't have to stay stuck in his old ways. He found himself standing outside a small local animal shelter just a few blocks away. It was a place he had never paid much attention to before, but now it seemed like the right thing to do. He took a deep breath and walked in. Inside, the shelter was warm and welcoming, with soft music playing in the background. The air smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, but it was also filled with the comforting scent of animals and their caretakers. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Hello," she said with a friendly tone. "Can I help you with anything?" The biker hesitated for a moment, not sure how to begin. He wasn't the type to ask for help, especially not for something like this, but he felt a strong urge to do something meaningful, something to make up for what he had done earlier. "I was wondering if there's anything I can do to help here," he said, his voice steady but unsure. "I want to do something good, something that matters." The woman looked surprised at first, but quickly recovered, giving him a warm smile. "That's very kind of you. We're always looking for volunteers to help with walking the dogs, feeding them, and making sure they're well cared for. If you want to spend some time with the animals, I'm sure they'd appreciate it." The biker nodded, feeling a surge of relief. This was it. This was the first step he needed to take. He wasn't sure how long it would take to undo the damage he had caused, but this felt like a beginning. "Great. I'd love to help," he said, his voice gaining confidence. The woman led him to a small room filled with several dogs of different breeds. Some were sitting calmly, others were more active, wagging their tails and looking up at him with curiosity. The biker knelt down to greet them, offering a gentle hand. He could feel the warmth of their bodies as they came closer, sniffing his hand and licking it in their friendly, innocent way. The experience was more healing than he had expected. As he spent time with the animals, playing with them, and taking them on short walks, he began to feel a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. These dogs, who had been abandoned or lost, were offering him a kind of forgiveness that he hadn't realized he needed. They didn't judge him. They didn't know about his past mistakes. They were just happy to be in the moment, enjoying the simple pleasure of being cared for. After spending some time with the dogs, the biker realized that he had done something more than just volunteering. He had begun to repair a part of himself, one small action at a time. He could feel the old anger and bitterness starting to melt away, replaced by a sense of purpose. He wasn't perfect, and he knew there was still work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. As he left the shelter later that afternoon, the biker felt lighter. The day had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He would keep trying. And with each step forward, he was becoming someone he could be proud of.